So yeah, I don't know how to put this, but I'm getting tired of this game. All right, I just need to get that last trophy. All right, but I am not willing to level grind another 100 hours just to get to level 99 or level 95. All right, so I did some microtransactions. I bought some level up boosters. All right, listen, I got my justifications. Right, they put such little effort into this DLC. Right, so I'm going to put as much effort into getting it done, all right? And apparently a little bit more money than they deserve, which I'm not really happy with myself about. But it is what it is, all right? So we're going to just do legendary mode. We'll do maybe 1/3 today, 1/3 tomorrow, and 1/3 day after. We'll see. But it is what it is. I have no regrets. All right. So let's just get into it. Let's finish this game. Okay. All right. Done deal. Look at me. I'm so honest. All right. Look at this. Level booster. Guess who this is going to? Ooh, look at that. The level booster. Look at that. Level 82. Wow. I have no regrets. Oh my gosh, level 95? You don't say. Level 87? Level 88? Level 89? 91, baby. 92. 93. 94. 95. 96. 97. 98. 99. That's as far as we can go with him. Now, for this guy.
みなぎるぜまだ強くなれるとはな力が湧いてきた悪くない気分だぜみなぎるぜ強くなれる力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれる力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれる力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれる力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれる力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれる力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜまだ強くなれるとはな
Oh my gosh. More level boosters.
力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれ力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれ力が湧いていない気分みなぎるぜ強くなれるとはな
Look at that. Look at that. Level 99, level 99. Alright, so now we got one more level booster, or 5 more. I'm going to give it to. Who are we going to give it to? So we give it to Chitose. She's my healer, right? Give it to Chitose and Namba. That's what's going to happen.
これで本気出せそう。また成長しちゃった。もっといける。吸収が早いのよね。これで本気出せそう。また成長しちゃった。
聞いてきた。大人の渋みが出てきたぜ。
Now, you know, all these other boosters. Health booster.
聞いてきた。
Go to the goat.
力が湧いてきた
みなぎってきたぜ。
みなぎるぜ力が湧いてきた
聞いてきた。
もっといける。
みなぎるぜ
力がみなぎってきたな。みなぎってきたぜ。
Mood booster.
聞いてきた。みなぎってきたぜ。
力がみなぎるぜ。
効いてきた。
My God, this is a lot of boosters.
力が湧いてきた。
効いてきた。
これで本気出せそう。もっといける。これで本気出せそう。
みなぎってきたぜ。効いてきた。
みなぎる。力が湧いてきた。みなぎるぜ。
みなぎってきた。効いてきた。
力がみなぎるぜ。
みなぎってきたぜ。効いてきた。
もっといける。
力がみなぎってきた。効いてきた。力がみなぎってきたな。力が湧いてき
You
た
know
ぜ。
why'd I do that?
みなぎってきたぜ。
力が湧いてきた。
効いてきた。みなぎってきたぜ。効いてきた。
Oh,
これで本気出せそう。
効いてきた。力がみなぎってきたな。
もっといける。
みなぎってきたぜ。
これで本気出せそう。
みなぎるぜ。
効いてきた。
力が湧いてきた。
I'm getting kind of annoyed by just doing this.
効いてきた。
みなぎるぜ。
みなぎってきたぜ。
力が湧いてきた。
もっといける。
Oh my God.
みなぎるぜ。力が湧いてきた。
効いてきた。
みなぎるぜ。
みなぎってきた
Alright,
ぜ。
almost done with the boosters.
効いてきた。
力が湧いてきた。
みなぎってきたぜ。
これで本気出せそう。
みなぎるぜ。
力がみなぎってきたな。
力が湧いてきた。みなぎるぜ。
効いてきた。みなぎってきたぜ。
All right.
そういうことか。俺もまだ若いね。
All right. All right. Can't say I feel good about this. I can't say I feel bad about it either. All right.
体のキレがいいです。
Gosh, if this comes back to haunt me in my YouTube gamer career, I'm not gonna care. I don't care. I already did almost everything else the right way, and this ain't the wrong way. It was available to me, and I took it. All right. Anyways, save. Premium adventure. Huh. All right. Let's just zoom through all of this. God, they're gonna make us do the tutorials again too, huh? I'll probably come back to revisit this game sometime in the future, you know, to enjoy the story and just the story alone. But for now, we need the trophies. I need to be able to delete this off my system. You know what? And while that's going on, since I don't get too much activity when it comes to this game, I'm going to put on a little podcast.
You're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Joining me today are astrologers Joe O'Neill and Kira Taborn, and we're going to be talking about
listen to some Chris
Saturn
Brennan.
and Aquarius.
You guys are going to learn something about some
of what it was
astrology
like for people
while
who
you
had
watch
their
me.
Saturn return in Aquarius over the past few years between 2020 and 2023. So, hey, welcome both of you.
Hey. Hey, thanks for having us, Chris.
Thank you for joining me today. And first, at the very top of this, I want to say congratulations on surviving both of your Saturn returns. You both have Saturn in Aquarius, and I know it's been like a year, so we're a little bit getting away from it now that we're in the thick of like Saturn in Pisces, but congratulations.
Thank you. That's good. Yeah,
Saturn
thank
also
you
just
so
crossed
much.
my ascendant, so I'm like feel very graduated.
Right.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, but it was interesting for me being a older astrologer now in my late, I'm 39 years old, but seeing a whole other, you know, I'm Saturn in Scorpio, so I did mine a while back, like almost 10 years ago now, and it was interesting to see the next generation of astrologers kind of behind me at the next Saturn square after mine go through their Saturn returns over the past few years, and for some of you, like having an idea of what that might be like, going into it, but then obviously like seeing it and experiencing it is a much different thing. I think everybody realizes once you actually go through it.
Definitely.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah. So, all right. So in this episode, we're going to be talking a little bit about. We've done 3 of these so far. This will be the 3rd one, where Lisa Scheim and I have previously gone through at the end of once Saturn leaves a sign. We'll go through and talk about some of the different Saturn return stories that occurred over the past 3 years, and we did that with Sagittarius. We did that with Capricorn. Now we're going to do that with Aquarius. We're going to talk a little bit about some celebrity Saturn return stories and how those turned out over the past 3 years. We're going to talk about also some listener submissions, where listeners of the Astrology Podcast over the past few months have sent in their stories about what happened during their Saturn return. We got a ton of submissions of those. We're not going to be able to go through all of them, but I did want to highlight some of them and integrate them into the discussion to whatever extent we can. And then also just see what kind of conclusions we can draw, what we've learned from this entire process about what the Saturn return is about, as well as what Saturn transits in general about,
so
as
close
well as
to
the
his
Saturn
work.
placement. And it's always really illustrative each time we do this, and I feel like we learn a lot, so I think this will be a fun exercise to do again here today.
I'm excited.
Alright.
I've been looking forward to this for a while, so.
Yeah, well, and you and I did the Saturn Signs of Millennials episode that actually ties in very nicely with this one at this point, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. All right. So, let me see. First, let me introduce some basic principles and just a recap from some of those previous episodes on Saturn returns, what the methodology is, and what some of our basic assumptions are about Saturn returns, which Lisa Scheim and I actually outlined way back in episode 24 of the Astrology Podcast, titled Understanding Your Saturn Return. And this is an audio-only episode from before when I wasn't doing videos. You'll have to find it on the podcast website. And then we also demonstrated some of these principles in the Saturn return in Sagittarius retrospective, which is episode 131, and episode 2
Awesome.
Saturn in Capricorn. So the first basic premise is that, in my definition, the Saturn return
I know how to play the game.
begins at the first ingress of Saturn back into its natal sign that it was in when you were born, and then eventually the Saturn return ends at the final egress, or the departure of Saturn out of that sign, where you have your natal Saturn. So this usually sets up about a 3-year period that takes place roughly between the ages of 27 and 30, I think, right? Okay. So the Saturn return is the most intense around when Saturn gets close to returning to that degree that it was in your birth chart. But so there are these like waves of intensity, and sometimes Saturn
Keep it
can
moving,
retrograde
baby.
over that point like 3 different times. But really, the Saturn return is often like experienced as a sequence of events that encompasses the entirety of Saturn transiting back through that natal sign of the zodiac that it was in when you were born. And I think that's like easy to understand abstractly, you know, ahead of time, but once you actually experience it and go through it and understand the totality of that being like a chapter in your life and a whole block of time, I think it starts to gain, you know, a deeper sense, or much more internalized sense. Was that the way for the two of you, or how did you experience it in terms of the difference between the sign ingress versus the degree ingress? I mean, I guess y'all are unique in that you're one of the only generations whose Saturn return started with like a worldwide pandemic, since Saturn ingressed into Aquarius literally in March and April of 2020. So it was just like, you know, bam, Saturn return starts, worldwide pandemic. So that's kind of, I guess that's easier question for you guys to ask rather than other generations.
Yeah, you go first, Joe.
Yeah, it's you know, it's kind of tough, especially
thing that-
well, first I should say my Saturn is at 2 Aquarius, so those peaks of intensity where those exact conjunctions happened were super early on in the process for me, but I will say that I did experience it as like a whole chapter in my life, as far as the entire time Saturn was in Aquarius, even when it was in those last degrees. But yeah, it's especially the first ingress of Saturn into Aquarius. It was kind of hard to gauge, you know, what I was experiencing and feeling, because so much else was happening that was kind of subsuming everybody's daily lived experience. And so I feel like for me, I noticed the most
That was happening.
personal
Saturn was on top of my
natal
son.
themes happening the
Right as
second
the
time
pandemic
Saturn
started.
ingressed into Aquarius, which was
Tough
late
times,
December 2020,
but
and then early 2021.
incredibly
So
productive.
for me, that's kind
and
of how
honestly,
it was, 'cause,
like,
you know, when lockdowns happened, everybody was
to a certain extent, good
experiencing,
times.
like,
Yeah.
very Saturnian themes of isolation and solitude and kind of quarantining themselves and having to do a lot of looking inward and facing all that uncertainty and fear. So for me, I started to notice more of what the personal experience would be like in that second ingress. But I'm curious what that was like for you too, Kira.
And
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
just really quick, that reminded me something about dates, which is that, so the time period we're talking about is March of 2020 until March of 2023. That's Saturn in Aquarius. But then Saturn did retrograde out of Aquarius for a bit in 2020, in like the summer of 2020, but then it came back into Aquarius in December of 2020. So that's probably important when people are thinking about their own chronologies as they're listening to this episode.
Yeah. I also have Saturn really early. I have it at 1 degree Aquarius. Joe and I are just a couple months apart. So yeah, I feel like that all of 2020 was very much a Saturn return experience in different ways, but it definitely kicked into gear in early 2021. Yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk more about our individual experiences, but so much so, just to echo what Joe was saying, it definitely feels like a period in my life. And I feel like very much like on the other side of it, which feels so good.
It really does.
It really does. And even, we'll get more into it, but even in the sense that I moved into this apartment December 19th, 2020, and I'm like ready to leave because it just feels like the chapter has ended, you know? But yeah, we'll get more into it.
Okay, so that's important about time frames. So other preliminary interpretive principles that we'll be applying in the charts. So the return degree is the most intense part. If Saturn is very early or late in the sign, then this can sometimes extend the period a bit. when Saturn by transit gets close to that, especially within 3 degrees. And this is something that's a little tricky with this Saturn, because Saturn, this past winter, over the past few months, even though it moved into Pisces in March of 2023, by like December, it retrograded back to 0 degrees of Pisces. So anybody with Saturn, especially at like 28, 29 degrees of Aquarius, was getting another hit of the exact, almost exact Saturn return of it coming within orb at least, even while Saturn was in Pisces. So I did want to mention that there can be some carryover, and I don't know if that was relevant for the two of you in terms of the build up to it. I don't remember how far Saturn got into Capricorn before it eventually ingressed later on in 2020, but that could be relevant as well. Alright, so that's true, and then next, the primary thing that we're going to focus on is that the house that Saturn is located in your birth chart is activated during the Saturn return, and it often will activate and put a greater deal of focus on the topics associated with that area of your life. So each of the 12 houses and whatever area of life or whatever topics are signified in that instance. Additionally, the 2 houses that Saturn rules are also activated. And this is something where we're going to see it not as clearly in this instance, because Saturn, when it's in Aquarius, is in one of its own signs. But we will see some overlap where whatever it is that the second house that is ruled by Saturn, which is Capricorn, that topic of that house will also be activated or tend to be activated in a person's life. And I know the two of you both had versions of that in terms of the house itself being activated as well as the house that Saturn rules, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Why don't we just like talk about your story then to begin with a little bit, if you feel like, or at least maybe we could just briefly say what topics were activated for the two of you and where Saturn's at. Okay. Alright, so, I mean, Joe, your main thing was like relationships, and Saturn's in your 7th house is just like the short.
Yeah, it was the classic Saturn return divorce. But the surprising part was it was also like finding love again and now a really solid relationship, which was a really pleasant surprise for me because I had the like Saturn return appear leading up to it. Like it's gonna be all bad. I have charts, so I wasn't super looking forward to it, but it turned out really constructive also. 6th house theme is interwoven in some ways too, but to keep it brief, I'll just leave it there for now.
Okay, and do you mind if I show your chart, or are you still open chart person?
Yeah, open chart, baby. Let's go.
Okay, all the way.
All the way.
So here's Joe's chart really briefly. So Leo rising, Saturn is in Aquarius in the 7th whole sign house, ruling both the 7th house of relationships as well as the 6th house of work and health. Okay, so we'll come back to that. And then Kira, what's your placement in house rulership? And are you okay sharing your chart, or do you prefer not to?
Yeah, I'm totally fine sharing. I have Saturn in Aquarius in the 12th house at 1 degree, also ruling the 11th house.
And what is the like short version of how those topics, either one or both of them, came up for you?
Yeah, I think community was a huge topic. I literally started an online membership community called the 11th House in December of 2020. It was a lot about, but also the 12th house isolation, mental health themes were huge as well. I moved across the country by myself, started living by myself for the first time, working for myself for the first time. And yeah, it was a lot of that 12th house isolation, loneliness stuff as well.
Yeah, isolation is both like a Saturn theme, but also like a 12th house theme majorly. And that's like a recurring one that actually came up, I think, in 1 or 2 examples as well. So it's interesting in terms of Saturn in the 12th house, and then also that you have it ruling the 11th house, so that there's almost a contradiction there, because also at the same time, community and friends and groups and alliances coming out at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And especially in 2020, all of the like online connections that were happening, that felt like a really cloud aspect of the like, yeah, Saturn
I
return.
like
really
how
made a lot
you
of sense,
search
and-
searching for treasure in this game, being able to
Yeah,
search for
that was
treasure in this
interesting
game
in
as soon
general
as you
of
lose a
Saturn and
job,
Aquarius, and
because you
how everybody,
are
how the world can
about
be,
to be broke.
suddenly more isolated than it's ever been due to the pandemic, but then
stuff.
also at the same time, people can be as connected as they were at that time, more than they've ever been through like social media and Zoom and everything else. The realism of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's really interesting. I think that's the interesting thing about a planet and its own sign. Is that there's like double significations often, or there's dual. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioning you starting your community thing in December of 2020 just reminded me that there was a weird thing that happened with the ingresses that year, which is in March of 2020, Saturn and Mars went into Aquarius at the same time. So that was like a very rough introduction to the Saturn return, especially for anybody with Saturn towards the beginning of the sign, so that their Saturn got hit by both transiting Saturn and Mars at the same time. But then in December of 2020, Saturn went back into Aquarius, but Jupiter ingressed into that sign at the same time, which was a bit more positive in terms of how that went at that point.
Yeah, it was definitely totally different vibe. I remember being so scared at the beginning when Saturn entered with Mars, like just so much fear. And yeah, definitely different towards. There was a lot more hope.
Speed
at
run
the
this
end there.
Yeah, it was like there was a way forward somehow where it was just like so disorienting and like jarring the first time with Mars. I feel like that's also just a really unique feature of this Saturn and Aquarius transit in general. There were like the squares with Uranus as well, but those two ingresses being, you know, Saturn being accompanied by like a malefic and then the greater benefic, there's just so much contrast. It's such an interesting Saturn return time for Saturn and Aquarius folks in general.
Yeah, and having a great conjunction, like a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius that was like setting off an entire 200-year era then of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions in air signs for the next like 2 centuries. That was another like a momentous way to like start your Saturn return.
Truly.
I mean, I was trying to think about that and think like, wow, this is unique. There's no other generation that has that, which is true to some extent. But then I guess it's like other generations probably have certain versions of that, maybe not quite as like obvious, but like Saturn in Gemini people back when like 9/11 happened, and the way that changed both in the US as well as the world or different parts of the world pretty quickly circled virtually. Or, I don't know, maybe you have people like Saturn and Capricorn people from 1989 type time frames where the Soviet Union sort of fell apart or when the Berlin Wall was built, things like that. So that maybe there are some types of generational things that are happening, like lots of groups or generations are experiencing simultaneously. But yeah, I don't know if we've seen one quite like this in quite a while that was just that global.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what happens when Saturn and Neptune go into Aries together, because yeah, we don't have to talk about that yet.
Yeah, I've got my eye on some Saturn and Pisces Saturn return people that we'll mention towards the end of this. Okay, last things in terms of interpretive principles. Day chart the Saturn return tends to be a little bit easier if you were born with a day chart, whereas night charts sometimes can be a bit more challenging. This can be offset though by a number of other factors. One of them that we outlined in the basic principles and we've seen happen over and over is that Saturn is mitigated when it's in its own domicile or exaltation. And this is true here in this instance with Saturn and Aquarius, where Saturn's in one of its own domiciles. And we've noticed previously that the Saturn return oftentimes is somewhat more manageable for those people compared to those that don't have Saturn dignified in some way. Let's see, mutual reception by domicile or having reception with its
Oh, it's
domicile
either,
lord is like
huh?
the next best thing. If you don't have that,
Mata
that's not
koyate.
relevant here. The next thing is Saturn is mitigated when it has aspects from benefics. This can be really helpful and it can offset whether the Saturn return is going to be experienced as a little bit more challenging or ultimately a little bit more constructive and successful. I have one really great example of that I'm going to give with Miley Cyrus, which I experienced benefic. The next thing is Saturn is mitigated when it has aspects from benefics. This can be really helpful and it can offset whether the Saturn return is going to be experienced as a little bit more challenging or ultimately a little bit more constructive and successful. I have one really great example of that I'm going to give with Miley Cyrus, which I made a prediction about because her Saturn is just like amazingly placed in Aquarius in the 10th house of career. And I thought she was going to have a really good Saturn return for career matters, and that turned out to be true, and she just won like a Grammy following a song that she released in her Saturn return. And she has Saturn. Actually, let me just pull that one up because it illustrates the point that I'm making right now. This is Miley Cyrus's like birth chart. She has Taurus rising. Saturn is in Aquarius in the 10th house. Conjunct Mercury is it's a day chart, so Saturn's in the second favor. It's in its own sign. It has this very nice and very close trine from Jupiter, about 8 degrees of Libra, and it's Saturn 13 degrees of Aquarius, which is providing a lot of additional support and mitigation and just positive support to that Saturn placement. So I sort of said in 2020 on Twitter just briefly like that she would be a Saturn return success story, and she ended up, I think the biggest thing was just that she released a single about the single Flowers, and it was largely about like a breakup with her ex, I think, right? And then that single ended up becoming her most popular one that she's ever released.
I don't care about Miley Cyrus, dude. Stop talking about Miley Cyrus. I don't care about your predictions about Miley fucking Cyrus. Why? Why would I?
Venus in Capricorn.
Why do I care about that, Chris? I don't.
So astrology good.
Use a cooler example.
It is so good. And yeah, it's perfect. I had never seen her chart either, so.
Yeah, well, and it's also, it brings up another point, which is like, it's actually one of my other interpretive principles, which, let me read here. Sometimes the houses square or opposite to Saturn get activated, especially mainly if the native has planets that are getting aspected in those signs during the return. And this is true partially because the return closes one cycle of Saturn, 128-year cycle, and opens up a new one that has its most important turning point in squares and opposition relative to the natal Saturn placement. So, in her case, she has that Saturn here, and Saturn was like closing one 28 to 30-year cycle in her life, but also opening a new one. And the important turning points of that, where it sets up a new cycle over the next 30 years, are going to be when Saturn makes its waxing square in the first house, its opposition in her fourth house, and eventually its waning square in her seventh house. But the fact that she has Saturn at 13 Aquarius squaring some planets in the seventh house, that means that when Saturn goes into Aquarius, it's going to be squaring those planets and activating them at the same time during the course of the Saturn return. So as a result of that, sometimes the Saturn is bringing in other houses that Saturn is aspected by a hard aspect because it's activating those other placements in the chart very strongly, which I realize looks like drawing in a lot of different houses at this point, but during the course of it, I think we do see, and I think during some of our examples, we'll see how that
Definitely relevant for mine. I'm swearing on my Scorpio placements, yeah. That was the worst part.
Right,
Yeah.
so your
go ahead.
Scorpio placements are in the 9th house, Kira?
Yeah, 9th house and lots of, I mean, I stopped teaching for 2 years. Yeah, a lot of 9th house stuff as well.
12 is activating these Scorpio planets, and those are your only fixed planets. And that was actually one that came up very strongly in the examples for some people. The two of you don't have it as closely, but there's some people with Saturn in mid to late Aquarius where it's squaring Pluto like much more closely, and I was seeing that come through very strongly in some of the examples that were submitted where people had a tight Saturn-Pluto squares and were activating some major tensions between those two houses. And some real difficulties in whatever the Pluto was.
Yeah. It was loud. I feel like the squares are the worst part of the Saturn return.
Okay. Yeah. You stopped teaching during that time. Was there any other ninth house stuff, or how would you?
This Chris Brennan
Yeah,
guy is freaking NyQuil.
I was just really.
I know he's a great astrologer and whatnot, but
It was just like a lot of like 9th house, 12th house, Saturn, and at the same time the South Node was also there in the 9th. But I was really curious because I learned to start learning astrology during my Saturn closing Saturn square when Saturn was in the 9th and the North Node was in my 9th. And so it was very much this like return and just feeling very lost, not knowing what I was going to do, if I wanted to continue doing astrology, and very, yeah, like lots of doubts, lots of Saturnian doubts.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah. So, and Joe, did you say your aspects were activated as well?
Yeah, for sure. I have the Sun in Leo in the first, and Jupiter also. So I got Saturn opposing the ruler of my ascendant, the ruler of my 5th and 8th, and just generally, I feel like the Saturn return theme. So like one of the first really big ones was my separation from my ex and my divorce, but it was also like a big interrogation of my self-concept, honestly, and just I had been in that relationship for a really long time. I got married really young, so it was an 11-year marriage at the end of it, just like 2 weeks shy of 11 years. So it was like first time being on my own and first time like creating my own infrastructure for my life, and it just challenged a lot of ways that I thought about myself. I was also very depressed, and it was an interesting time too because also professionally things were going really well. I had given like my first professional talk on the 12th house. That's become really the foundation of my practice, and so it was like an interesting kind of bifurcation where it was like my personal life was really, really difficult, and then my online and professional life was like going really well. But yeah, the first house themes came through really strongly for me, for sure. Just a lot of doubt through, like you said, Kira, kind of questioning like, how do I know like what's real or true about me and the situation? Just having to figure it out and navigate it was a big thing.
Did your living situation change as a result of this split?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, actually, a week after my 30th birthday, which would have been moving into my second Saturn-ruled perfection year, 7th house year, that's when I moved out, and I stayed moved out, so sure did. My parents also moved home from living in Colorado around this time, this whole Saturn return time, so it was like, it really did bring back.
I think that comes through really strongly for people with angular Saturns, that especially if they have planets or planets in each of those signs, usually appear just that all of those houses can be brought in, and then, as like I said, it also is setting up stuff where it's setting a foundation for that entire cycle. It's like in 7 years you'll get a check-in point when Saturn is in Taurus, and then in 14 years you'll get another check-in when Saturn goes through Leo. And then
Pretty strong
weekend. So, but it's interesting how much with the first house, that's something that came up for me during my Saturn return, because I have Aquarius rising, so Saturn rules my ascendant, but what the first house and that keyword is self, which seems so abstract, is something that really comes up with the first house being activated by transits in astrology, but also to some extent in the Saturn return in general, and that idea of self and who am I is much more tangible than it sounds like when you just like read it on paper.
Totally.
Yeah. All right. So
No
last
one in this
things-
podcast seems particularly
particularly
enthused.
From the benefics. Saturn
Feels
is
like
made
a-
more challenging when it has hard aspects
feels
from
like
other
a-
malefics, especially Mars. Like
Can't even
conjunction,
call it a
square opposition.
college
in
lecture.
this case, I saw some people with Pluto squaring Saturn, where that also seemed to be making things a little bit more tough, a little bit more intense,
Is there like
transformative,
another-
sometimes more extreme
Is there any-
instances of like
開けてみるか。
transformation.
やったぜ。
To use that as both a useful term as well as a euphemism were happening like for people when that was activated. So pay attention to those hard aspects with other difficult planets. And finally, yeah, planets that Saturn transit aspects during the transit will get activated. That's what we've already talked about. Okay, so those are basically all of the basic principles. But other than that, in terms of themes, some of the major
My God.
themes that we expect to see during the Saturn return are one, a transition to adulthood, or the full transition into adulthood, highlighting themes
How
of
do
like
how do I
maturity
get out of
and
here?
growth. Is that something both of you feel like you experienced or like saw in your contemporaries?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. I think one of my biggest like complaints like in my head during my Saturn return is just like I just want someone else to do all this for me. Like I just want my mom to come in and do all like take care of this. And just the realization constantly that no one's going to save you. You have to save yourself. Like that was a big one for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're truly like on your own and like setting stuff up, and that there's not necessarily a support thing underlying. it. Sometimes you have to create that for yourself, otherwise no one will necessarily step in and like put something underneath you.
Yeah, hard relate to the feeling of like wishing someone would kind of like come help you with all this or come save you from it, and just like that moment where it feels like your feet finally hitting the ground for the first time. Like there's the gravity and the weight, and like you realize it's a long path, but like there really isn't anyone to save you but you. And like that too is kind of an abstract concept, but I feel like I knew about the maturity themes and the kind of fully transitioning into adulthood themes before my Saturn return, but like having that experience it made it so much more tangible and substantial. But I will say, when you do something hard, like if you start lifting weights or something, like you start to see your strength grow, and you're like, oh, this is what like capacity feels like. This is what a boundary line actually feels like, and how it actually works. And it just takes like the work to do it. And Saturn kind of spares no one in that regard. But worth it though.
Yeah.
Great analogy. It's like Saturn goes retrograde a bunch of times during the course of going through your natal Saturn sign over that 3-year period. And it's almost like those retrogrades are like the reps of lifting the weight each time, and each time you get like a little bit better at doing the parts that are manageable, because obviously there's certain parts of the Saturn return where you run into a wall where it just says like you can't proceed further, like this door has to close, and others will be opened, but at least for this one that's it. But there are some themes, especially when it comes to some of the adulthood and like maturity themes, that do seem like they're a muscle that you're strengthening over the course of that 3-year period.
Yeah, I always describe it to my clients like a stress test. Like when they have those, like they plant new baby trees and they have them kind of held up by those little ropes at first. I always say it's like you're taking those ropes off, and it's like the first couple storms, and you have to like weather these storms in order to get stronger. Yeah, I like the muscle analogy a lot.
That's good. I like that. That's a really good analogy. I like the tree analogy. It's like when you're learning how to ride a bike, if you have like training wheels on, but then all of a sudden somebody takes the training wheels off, and you realize you're just balancing yourself, and you could easily like topple over and take a big spill. But as long as you stay focused and exert like everything you've learned up to that point, you can actually do it. You realize that you can actually ride that bike and keep going. All right, so other themes, challenges and hardships. So it often involves, the Saturn Return often involves facing challenges, hardships, sometimes losses, which can lead to feelings of depression or heaviness. And I know that that can be a major theme because sometimes Saturn can, like I said, either close a door or it can take something away. You know, sometimes what's being taken away, like our first point is like metaphorical, is like youth. Like you realize your youth is being taken away and that that's something that's not necessarily coming back in some sense. But in other instances, what's being taken away or removed from one's life can be much more tangible.
Yeah, I feel like with it being in a 12th house and squaring my cadent, it was just so intangible, so much of it, and so mental. But yeah, I see, especially with the angular folks and even the succedent Saturn folks, that there's a lot more tangibility to the problems and a lot of like effort that needs to be exerted to move through it.
Yeah, it's funny that you said like youth going away, because I was just kind of like looking through like some of the dates for mine up until this recording of the past couple days, and I was realizing that during my Saturn return was the first time I started noticing like more and more like just visible signs of aging. Just I was like, my skin is like for real different than it was in my 20s, which like it doesn't bother me even now, but just like those changes and just being like, this is very tangibly different. Like, like I have more fine lines and stuff, and like my body doesn't work or recover in the same way as it used to. Yeah, it's very real.
It's so real. The way your body changes is like, what
Rock
is happening?
the body. Rock the body.
It's very, very weird. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say though that like one of the key themes with Saturn that I see so much is like sustainability and like making sure what you're doing is sustainable, whatever that's pertaining to. And like Saturn has taught me how to prioritize sustainability in just so many areas of life, whether that is the way I'm using my body or like treating my body or whatever else it is. So that's like a good thing that comes from being like, oh, I'm reaching limits with my body and it's changing and different. There's like some unexpected stuff there in my experience.
Yeah, I feel like just to kind of one more thing about the aging thing, I have realized how different, like how much older I am than other people now. And it's like you'll be around younger, I call them the youth, you know, like, and you'll be like, oh my god, I'm old, like I'm really old, you know. You're not really old, but like it's just this, it's very weird and it's hard to describe, but you become a lot more aware of your age, especially around younger people. Yeah.
I remember people, like coworkers, when I was still working like a retail day job, like they'd be like, how old are you? I'd be like, oh, I'm 31. They'd be like, oh my god, you're old. Like I had no idea.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Okay, 31 is not that old, but also true. Like you're 22, of course. Like I felt the exact same way when I was 22. So
Age ain't nothing but a number. Going out ain't
Really
nothing
good
but a
just
thing.
awareness of age and aging and an awareness that you didn't have like up to that point that becomes like much more stark and in some instances like tangible or concrete in some way. I famously like started losing my hair during my Saturn return, which is my funny first like house aging thing as a parallel with yours.
I chopped mine off when Saturn squared my sun, yeah.
Nice. That's
I
pretty cool.
also chopped my hair during my Saturn return, actually, just not as short as you guys.
Yeah, well, you did it pretty short. Like on some of the previous episodes, I know there was like one of them that you're on. That's interesting. Maybe that's a theme that we didn't.
Oh,
Misawa. Maybe like chopping off hair as a Saturn return theme. That
Maybe
requires...
it's because we all have fixed suns though, and it's like aspect of our suns.
True. That's very true.
Yeah, that could make sense. Okay. All right, so next, testing limits. This period is marked by testing and understanding one's limits, both personally and in a broader context in life. that can also be in
ありがね
boundaries.
全部置いてきな
さっさと始めようぜ
Austin has used an analogy
俺の番だ
before, like sometimes you reach a point sometimes with Saturn you realize that once you've expended all your energy, it's like your gas tank is empty, and you don't have this like infinite source of like this well of like energy of youth. So that sometimes if you push yourself too far,
I'm
or
piecing
past a
myself
certain
here.
boundary, you know, you kind of collapse. And I think Saturn return can sometimes be the first realization of that as a theme.
Yes.
Yeah,
very
this
much
little
so.
slog.
I think about it all the time. Like people used to be like, Kira, how do you do so much? And I'm like, I don't know, I just do. And now I'm like, how the hell did I do all the things that I did?
前によく行ってた
Saturn
店があるん
return,
ですよ
it literally,
よかったらそこ
I
へ行
like
きましょう
I can't even
春日さんは
imagine
苦手なもの
doing,
とかない
you
です
know,
か
a quarter
ど
of
んなんでも
all the
ウェ
things
ル
I
カ
used
ムだ
to
よ
do on a
お前は何
regular
出してもうまそう
basis.
に
Yeah,
食う
you
なって
very
よ
much
く言われ
become
る
a lot more aware of your limitations.
安心しました
おう
Yeah, I
Agent
feel like
Osusime no
before
mise na
my
ra
Saturn
kitai
return,
shika
I had this
nee
like
ze.
infinite
Tada,
capacity
あんまり
for
高いとこだと
like,
ちょっ
and
と
this was a
懐
seventh
具合
house
が
Saturn
よ
return, just like adapting
心配なく
to
ご
my
く庶民的な店ですよ
relationship and the situations that you know
それよかった
arose there. And my Saturn return was most definitely me hitting a wall and being like, I think I
旅行ってのはいいよな。
finally found like my hard
こうい
boundary,
う
like my
新しい
hard
出
no
会い
of
があ
like
る
I
い
just
きなり出
actually
くわしたのが
cannot
強盗で
continue.
なきゃ
When
もっと良か
previously
った
there
け
had
ど
been
よ
so many checkpoints, and I
で
was
す
like,
よね
why do I have such a
で
big
も
capacity
本当に
for
めったに
bullshit?
あ
But
る
I
ことじゃない
couldn't
んで
like
す
find the
そういや
whatever I needed
あ
to
の
like
強
really
盗どうなったか
make a
な
change. But like
警
that,
察に
it
撃ち
really did
殺さ
feel
れ
like
たり
hitting a
して
wall.
ねえ
Like
か
when my Saturn
あ
return
んな
really
やつのこと
hit,
心
and
配
it's
するんですか
They could have
It's
not have just made
something
this
has
a
to give.
cutscene.
悪党ってわけでもなさそうだったからよ
すごいですね
Alright, other themes, constructive hard work. There's an emphasis on striving towards long-term goals through consistent effort.
This is where Final Fantasy VII
Sometimes
Rebirth
achievement of
trumps
something
over
will be a new high
this
point,
game.
Although sometimes there can also
Cutting the fat.
one thing that
Cut
struck me as
the fat,
consistent in
Sega.
return submissions from listeners was
Cut the fat,
finding out
RGG.
that they didn't want to continue proceeding in a certain path in some direction where their Saturn was placed in life, especially if it was tied in with their 10th house in a certain career path, and literally having the ending of that career, which then led them to a new one, which ended up working out and being the best, but having at least having a somewhat unexpected like ending to something. I think was a theme that kept coming up over and over again.
yeah.
I see that a lot with clients, yeah. Whether it's like they start a new career path and start going to school for something new, or they just are like, yeah, I got here and I realized I don't want to do this at all.
Right. Yeah, realizing that you don't want to do something. I think that's a great keyword or a great phrase.
I see it with clients a lot too, where it's like this sense of like,
春日さん
like
手
it's
伝い
like
ま
you
す
can feel the clock ticking in a different way, and you start to realize that like if you stay on the path you're on right now, you're gonna be there for a while, and so like realizations start to set in, and like you discover now is the time to make these, like major changes if you want the future to be different, your future to look a different way. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And Saturn also, like, one of its basic principle underlying its significations is to reject or to say no to things. And sometimes saying no to something, sometimes that can be hard or difficult, but sometimes it can also be necessary. I think saying no to certain things, which is then adjacent to the notion of setting boundaries,
ありがとうご
is
ざいま
very
す
much part of that experience.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, last point of themes, life turning points. The Saturn return is generally remembered as a major turning point marked by significant
春日
achievements
さん
or
は
profound
きっ
changes.
とお友達がたくさんいるんでしょう
So,
ねなんていうか
achievements are sometimes
気安く
things,
話せる雰囲気があ
reaching
り
a
ま
new
すよ
milestone
あ
in
りが
some
とうよ
area of
エイ
one's
ちゃん
life. I think
も
is
し
a
よかっ
really
たら
common Saturn
今度
return
日
theme
本で
and
ダチ
something
を
we'll
紹介
see
す
in
る
a
ぜ
number of different stories.
そんな私なんかきっとお邪魔ですから
大丈夫だって
Can I add
Alright.
one more
暇しちゃってっ
theme
からよ
Please.
that we kind of touched on?
さっき
But
春日さん言ってま
that
し
is
たけど
just really
お住
loud
ま
for
いは
me, which
横
is
浜だったんです
the
ね
reparenting
なあ
process.
偉人
She
ちょう
kind
だ
of
い
touched on it with like the
初めてあ
maturing,
の
but
町に行った時
there's
は俺
something with
銃に撃たれた
having
ばっかで
to
よ
not just
そこのホ
like
ームレス
become
に
your own
命
parent
を助けられたん
and
だ
kind of parent yourself in the ways that either one you never got or two you're just not going to get anymore because you're an adult. And then also I find to be a very consistent theme is having to parent your parents. And there's just something that just comes up often with both clients and myself where there's this situation that comes up where you have to like parent your parents. And yeah, just the whole parenting, being your own advocate and like caring for yourself and setting boundaries for yourself, and learning how to do that. But I mean, my mother, she also has Saturn in Aquarius. She lost her mother during our Saturn returns, and things like that. And I remember there was something that happened with my younger sister with our dog dying, and I remember having to tell my mom, like, you're the parent, like you need to go and do X, Y, and Z, and just it being this realization, like, oh, I'm literally feeling like I'm parenting my parents right now. That's just another theme I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up because I feel like that's so true in my experience too. And like a phrase that came to me while you were reflecting on all that was like becoming the central authority figure in your own life when like previously maybe that role was occupied by someone else. But there's so many different ways that this can happen, whether it's like reparenting or reparenting ourselves and then playing the parent role with our parents, or just having to do stuff ourselves that's like difficult we've never had to do on our own before. But there's like something there with the concept of like parenting and that like kind of elderly figure. So yeah, I really
that's a great one. And also just
the man
stage in life in your late 20s and early 30s where you realize you're a lot of people, you're like when your parents were raising you, and then realizing like, oh my god, like how were they raising me at this age? Like I don't feel like I could be doing that. Or in some instances some people are raising children, which gives you a lot of perspective, like hitting that age where you came into your parents' life in some instances, and then wrestling with having a sudden realization of, when they were raising me, like they didn't know answers, they didn't necessarily know what was going on. They were just as sort of like struggling to establish some of these themes that I'm struggling with now as I am now, and that gives you a much different perspective on your parents, I think, than you have growing up to some extent.
Yeah, for sure.
Alright, are there any other themes like that, like 4 Saturn Return themes that I'm forgetting, or either that are standard ones or that I did not read them?
Back problems. Back problems, I don't know, there's just that's another consistent one I've seen, especially with the Saturn and domicile folks. I'm having it now with Saturn on my ascendant, but it definitely, just like I think it just comes with aging, the body stuff we talked about. But in particular, back and teeth problems. Luckily, my teeth I have Saturn.
He's so agile
but,
for
a lot of people go through teeth and dental problems.
I feel like that makes sense with Saturn ruling the bones. It's just like your bones just have a hard time, and like whether it's like your back or your teeth or whatever.
I think that's a first foreshadow that he's not exactly who he appears to be.
Back or bones and teeth are huge Saturn themes, and because it also brings up another point, which is just if you haven't taken care of yourself up to that point, then it starts to show, and you start to like pay for it. You start to have consequences, so that at that point sometimes it forces you to start taking better care of yourself than you had up to that point, because all of a sudden you realize that you're not invincible anymore.
Yes, and sobriety. Sobriety is another one.
Yeah, which is really interesting, and that came up in several different stories that were submitted, because Saturn normally metaphorically is like considered to be a sober type of planet, in the sense of like not being carefree or something or being restrained or something, but sobriety also in a more tangible sense of that we usually talk about it in terms of not using drugs or alcohol or other things like that, is also a really common Saturn return theme.
Yeah,
Yeah, it didn't happen with
one
my
of
Saturn
my
return, but it happened when
exes,
Saturn
he
went
was-
on
I
top
was
of my
with him
son
when
for
he
me.
was going
So
through his Saturn return and
there's that.
alcoholic and Saturn conjunct Neptune, and he had like gotten his second DUI when we were together, so he had a forced sobriety moment.
Stop!
And I remember, and yeah, this was like a whole thing, but I just remember being like, yeah, and of course not, I hadn't gone through it yet, but just trying to coach him through a Saturn return. He didn't hear it, but I was like, this is part of it. It's time to get sober.
Yeah, sobriety was a part of mine too, although
I love this.
when I quit drinking, that was February 2020, so
Great
it was
scene.
just before my Saturn return, but I don't know if you felt this way, Kira. I feel like, and I think part of it was like perfection years were involved because Saturn was activated back to back, but I definitely felt like the build up when Saturn was in Capricorn. That was Saturn opposite my moon, but I feel like lots of my clients as well were like, did we get double Saturn returns because of the Saturn and its domicile thing? But yeah, kind of living sober for that first year or two was a huge part of the way I was experiencing all of these other themes, like just the consequences of what had been going on the past decade, really. So
Yeah.
Which is so amazing because on the one hand, Saturn is supposed to be about like hard reality and like facing reality, as opposed to, let's say, like Neptune, which is more like dealing with illusory things broadly, metaphorically. But also Saturn is also about exercising restraint and also doing things that are hard and doing things that require repetition and just going in day after day and doing it over and over again, which is another major part of sobriety, is like doing something that's hard that maybe one part of you doesn't want to do, but another part of you realizes that you need to, and therefore you have to work on it constantly.
yeah, definitely that like one day at a time mentality is very Saturnian in general, I think.
Yeah, for sure. All right, awesome. Well, I think that's all good broad themes. Let's talk about some other charts. Let's talk about some celebrity charts, some listener
I'll kick
charts.
you down a notch.
Let's start with some of the celebrity ones. I already talked about Miley Cyrus. I did want to show my tweet just to do a victory lap on that. I was pretty happy with it. So September 2020, I said calling it now. Miley Cyrus as a Saturn return in Aquarius. So well placed, and it wasn't that she didn't go through difficulties, since obviously she also struggled with the after effects of the relationship, but that she was able to channel some of that loss and
2010.
difficulty
What a year.
into that song, and then ended up winning the Grammy as a result of it shortly after Saturn return. I think it's just a good example of somebody doing the Saturn return relatively well, success during it, rather than it always being necessarily this really difficult or like hard time. Because I think it's something Saturn returns, even though it's important to acknowledge the difficult and challenging parts, also it's important not to like freak people out too much, because there can be some really good things that happen during the Saturn return as well.
Yeah, I feel like even through all the, maybe this is, day chart privilege, but I feel like it was really, really hard, especially the squares. The exact return was fine, but I'm so grateful for it. Like, I feel like I'm probably, like, in a lot of material ways worse off than I was at the beginning, but in mentally, spiritually, emotionally, feel so much better and stronger. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right, another celebrity one I found recently. I just found this one recently, but it's Princess Mako of Japan, who has Saturn in the 7th house in a night chart with Leo rising, and she actually gave up her royal status in order to marry a commoner, marry a non-royal person, basically, And what was interesting about it is that they had announced that they were going to do this back when Saturn was in Scorpio, at the waning square of her Saturn sort of cycle, or 30-year Saturn cycle. But then they just finally did it recently while Saturn was in Aquarius, going through her 7th house of relationships. So I thought that was a really fascinating case, especially because, you know, obviously that doesn't happen to everybody, but it's a pretty cool
Dude.
manifestation of that.
Yeah, that is
Okay.
really cool. I can't believe they've
Skip
been
that.
with
Thank
each
God.
other that long. That whole 7 years, they were just like getting ready.
春日
I mean, yeah, I guess there was just lots of like details surrounding it, because she also ended up
Are you ready to
relinquishing
drink?
like payments or something that she would have gotten, like money, but she ended up rejecting it. So it's like, it's interesting because it's also a night chart, and it's like there's difficulties in that she's having to give something up in order to do this, or have this thing that she wants. But it's also, there's like, it's also something that she wants, even though she's making a hard decision. So it's an interesting combination of challenging and positive things.
Yeah, especially with that exalted moon right on the midheaven, like square Saturn, opposite Mars. Like there are so many interesting things about this chart. Like sacrificing your status for a relationship is like the most Saturn overcoming the exalted moon in a square thing that I've ever heard.
And then looking at her benefics, like in Virgo, it's like, yeah, she has these like fallen planets on top of all these very domiciled, exalted planets, and it's, I mean, night chart, the Venus one's out, you know, she did it for love.
It's romantic, honestly.
Yeah,
Wow, I'm obsessed with this chart. Thank you, Chris.
yeah.
Yeah, I was really happy to have found that.
後悔するな
Just
よ
really quickly to run through, Elvis, I recently discovered, had Saturn in Aquarius in the 3rd house of siblings in the night chart. Weirdly, he had a twin who was born 35 minutes before him, but
Deal
it
with those goons.
died. It was actually a stillborn child. So just in terms of his natal chart, that's interesting. Saturn in the 3rd night chart, he lost a sibling like at birth. But also recently, you know, those biopics of Elvis came out, especially the main one that happened like a year or two ago during his Saturn return. And I thought that was really interesting, and I'll probably come back to that and expand on it more in an episode I'm working on like posthumous astrology, which is that our charts continue to work and operate even after we die, as long as the memory of us is still like echoing in time.
かかってきやがる
Cool. That was a cool episode.
しつけが足りなかったみ
Yeah.
たいだ
All right. Another one, Saturn Aquarius return I saw that was really cool, and it's less connected to the house placement, but it was Conan O'Brien, who's like the famous talk show host that I kind of grew up watching. And his story initially was sad because like over, what, a decade ago, 15 years ago now, he like got The Tonight Show, which was like the biggest talk show at the time on like television. But then somehow it was like taken away from him after only like a year of him doing it, and it was this big, seen as this big downfall, or this big catastrophe, that he lost his dream job that he had aspired to get for like 20 or 30 years up to that point. But what was interesting is during his Saturn return over the past 3 years, over the past decade, he started a podcast, and it started like building up and becoming more and more successful. But then eventually, when he got to his Saturn return, the podcast just seems like it's been wildly successful, and it was bought by like Sirius FM or something like that for millions and millions of dollars, so that he got both a really good deal and was successful in terms of that financially. But also I realized in watching a recent episode where he was reflecting on like the last 30 years of his life, that he ended up, despite like the hardships, ended up pushing him in a direction so that he's just at the right place in the right time, doing the right thing right now, and he's having a good time, and his life is fulfilling. And even though he lost what he thought was his dream job, it ended up allowing him to do something that was eventually much more suited for him, and just puts him in a much better position nowadays than doing like a talk show every night would have in retrospect.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, he got a whole podcast network, I think, was started during that. And then, yeah, I didn't know he got bought. The podcast got bought. That's awesome.
Yeah, so it's actually doing really good. He's like interviewing a lot of like famous celebrities right now, but he's doing like really long form, engaging, interesting interviews that he's able to like do his usual humor and stuff, but it's actually much more interesting and engaging and much more relevant for the times when podcasts have become so huge over the past decade, versus talk shows in some ways have fallen a little bit more by the wayside in terms of that format that was much more popular and suited for like the 90s or like the early 2000s or something. All right, so there's that one. What other? I've got a couple more, but what celebrity ones like jump to mind for either of you that have been major ones or ones that you wanted to share?
Do you have any, Joe, that you? I mean, I wrote down a couple. I guess like, oh, there's so many. Johnny Depp. I kind of look at Johnny Depp and Brad Pitt together, because there was so much about like, yeah, their relationships, and both kind of fell out of public. What's the word I'm looking for? Like out of favor in the public. They used to be humongous stars, like, you know, hottest.
I just canceled your plane.
Celebrities, and especially, I mean, both of them. But yeah, now they're kind of into these really messy relationships and abuse allegations.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say I was like briefly looking at Johnny Depp's chart for this reason, and I feel like if I'm doing the math right, there was like a 12th house perfection year going there with this like very high Saturn return stuff going on, and I was just like, that's rough for him, but yeah, that is so interesting, like the huge kind of like fall from favor in the public eye.
Right. Well, and for Depp especially, because he has Leo rising, Saturn was in his 7th house, and the entire thing was that there was this very highly publicized trial between him and his ex-wife, where there was all these like allegations being thrown back and forth, and it became this like circus or like spectacle. So that's actually a really interesting example of like a Saturn return in the 7th house that's on the much more extreme, like negative side.
Yeah, I mean, there was like,
Well, he
I
came
think
out on top.
multiple
I guess he
like
has Saturn in
docuseries
Aquarius,
about
so,
it. It's just, yeah, huge public spectacle.
And maybe it's relevant
pretty
in
well.
that sense that Saturn, because Saturn's at like 23 Aquarius, and it's squaring his Mercury and Venus and Taurus in the 10th house, so maybe that's part of why it was also not just very public, but also why it had an effect then on like public perceptions of him or on his career or other things like that, because it's activating the natal sort of tension between those two houses due to the placements involved. All right, that's a pretty good one. Let's see, other celebrity ones. One that was sent in by listener Vandana Gayan pointed out that Michelle Yeoh was the first Asian American actress to win the Academy Award for Best Actress for her role in Everything, Everywhere, All at Once in 2022, and she has Saturn in Aquarius at her birth time. But that was a really interesting one because it was huge. Also,
I actually really
that,
enjoy
like,
these mini games.
she hadn't received an award like that earlier in her career, but now that she was like later,
Dude, imagine
you know,
running
in her late 50s, that
around the
received
corner
Academy
and
Award at that time,
person you see
there
is
were-
Kiryu
there was
blocking
a
your
huge
way,
component
your
to it
path,
that-
telling
that
you
people were talking about
that
at
the chase
time
is
when that
over.
happened. So
You're
it
done.
keeps
You're finished at
striking
that point.
And a good reminder that sometimes during Saturn returns and Saturn transits, that sometimes there can be like an age discussion that comes up connected to whatever's happening at that time.
That was a really good one.
Yeah, well, it was really heartening, and it was a cool movie that she was just like perfect for that role. And it's like that time when just that one role comes along that the actor really nails, and then they also sort of not just perceive but recognize for that. They receive the
That's got
accolades.
real soon, bogus Barney.
Doing a great job. I think that's another great Saturn return game.
For sure. And she has a Leo sun, right? So this is also like a really nice like Saturn return opposite, like opposing Leo placements that actually turned out really well, like worked out really well for her. So I like that part of it too.
Yeah, this is apparently the chart with like Saturn at 7 Aquarius, and it's opposing the Sun at 13 Leo and Mercury at 21 and Uranus at 29 Leo.
Something we didn't really mention in the beginning is when Saturn's retrograde natally, there can often be those like delayed. It doesn't surprise me. It took her like second Saturn return to really, receive her flowers, because we often get those delayed gratification with retrograde planets.
That's a really great point. Yeah, and then you're like doubling it up, like Saturn, which is already dealing with like time-related things and age, and then retrogrades, which often delay the manifestation.
Yes, that makes sense, Chris Brennan.
Good point. Let's see, the only other one, Vandana also submitted Tom Cruise, saying that Top Gun Maverick was released in 2022 and premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, where he earned an honorary Palme d'Or, and the film earned over $1 billion, which is the highest grossing film of his career, which is also kind of interesting because it was like a throwback to like over 30 years earlier to the first Top Gun movie, which was in like the late 80s.
I did not know it did
All
that
those
well,
Postmates.
honestly. I haven't seen it,
Pound
but
mates.
that's great for Tom Cruise. Very Saturn return.
Mofo's
of him.
gonna get pounded,
Yeah.
baby.
Yeah, I didn't have any interest in seeing it. I didn't think there was like any way that a movie 30 years later could be any good. I got like talked into seeing it. It was actually pretty good. It was decent.
Yeah, I've
So-
only heard good things.
Yeah, I don't know. So, all right, moving on to other celebrities. One that who netted out was Jeanette McCurdy.
Yeah.
Name I haven't heard in a while, Chris Brennan.
An actress. Was she on Nickelodeon?
I think she was on iCarly, yeah.
Yeah, iCarly. And she wrote this hugely selling book. I'm glad my mom got it. And it was published during her Saturn return. She has a moon Saturn Pluto square natally. We don't have the time. But yeah, she wrote that book, and it was a huge hit.
Just that title is like very Saturn return. Like it's very straight to the point. It's very blunt. It's about death. It's about a parent. Like it's a lot.
Yeah.
It looks like we might have gotten a time. I'm calculating the chart.
At the end of
now.
the tutorials, I hope
But
so.
What was the?
Yeah, so essentially, in the book, she explains all the horrible abuse she endured with her mom, like a lot of different types of abuse. And yeah, kind of explains the why. I didn't read the book, but I just remember a lot of discussion around it.
Just checking, but yeah, there's Master Data Bank is saying birth certificate in hand, so I think this is correct. And if it is, she has Leo rising. Saturn's at 17 degrees of Aquarius, and just this is one of the first examples then of what I was talking about earlier. Look how close that Saturn-Pluto square is, where Saturn's at 17 Aquarius, and it's closely squaring Pluto at 20 degrees of Scorpio, which is in her 4th house. And you're just saying part of the premise of that book was she was like talking very openly about the abuse she received from her mother basically growing up.
Yeah, and just looking, I've seen an exalted moon countless times, where people have very controlling mothers. I like to say like super mom, which isn't always the best, sometimes it's like, especially in the times like about appearances and yeah, especially with the malefic aspect and detriment right there. Involved in that.
For the audience listeners, the moon's at 14 Taurus, Mars at 8 Taurus, and they're both in the 10th house.
Yeah, and ruling the Sun, Venus, and Mercury in the 12th from the 10th, like that has extremely. What comes to mind is like dance mom, but or like theater mom, like acting working mom stuff. Like, and from what I understand,
Good
from
delivery.
there was a lot of like.
I love the South
forced
Park
to act
voice.
and, like ending up being the breadwinner for the family, and like lots of being pushed by her mother and things like that. It's a really interesting exalted moon and manifestations for Saturn.
Yeah, very malefic.
Yep.
Malefic exalted. Oof, that's tough. That's a tough combo.
It's interesting with the interchange between the 12 and the 10th as well, because the 12th is generally about loss, but it's connected here with the 10th of career, and that's a super literal manifestation that she's like, her title of her book is literally I'm Glad My Mom Died. That's also, I think, speaks to that a little bit as well. Just reading a synopsis, but it said in the book that the abuse included emotional manipulation, controlling behavior, enforcing an acting career upon her,
Kill the delivery.
as well as child stardom and the psychological toll of that, which is, that's an interesting Saturn. Kids
Crazy
that are
delivery.
forced to like grow up or be developed as they before they're ready to. Alright, so that's a good one.
Good delivery.
That's the other ones. What was the Michelle Obama one? She has Saturn in Aquarius.
Yeah, she just, I don't know, it's kind of boring. She just had a lot going on during her Saturn return. She like was involved in documentaries and different podcasts, and she wrote another book, and yeah. She
Nobody cares about Michelle
around that
Obama.
time. But yeah, kind of boring.
Yeah, we don't have a birth time for her, so we don't necessarily know what house it is. And then you had Jeff Bezos here. Who also
Good delivery.
Yeah, he had a divorce. I don't remember if it was. I think it was during Saturn return, but more notably, his wealth was, he gained so much wealth during his Saturn.
Good delivery.
And he's of course an Aquarius, Capricorn sun. I remember a lot of this started kicking off when Pluto came to his sun. And yeah, there's
Yeah.
massive amounts of wealth.
I'm just pulling up the chart, and it looks like he also has a Venus-Saturn conjunction. So that's an interesting. This is just it's not the houses, but Saturn is 21 Aquarius and Venus at 24. So that's an interesting point. Just sometimes whatever planet Saturn is with will also get activated as well. And it's activating those aspects and combinations. So sometimes whatever the general meaning of the combination is can be what that's about. And oh yeah, that right, because his story was like he and his wife separated. He got together with somebody new, but then his wife did something because she like had billions of dollars from the stock
I think
from
he
Amazon.
cheated. Yeah, I think he cheated, and that was, there was, she had proof, which is why, she had such a crazy divorce settlement. And
Break the river.
yeah, now she's like known for her philanthropy. I was going to say philanthropy.
That's what I was gonna say, because she then donated just like a ton of money to charities and stuff. She gave away like a lot of what she took from the divorce. It's pretty interesting, pretty cool. Alright, so I think that might be good. You mentioned Jon Stewart, so he's Saturn in Aquarius?
Yes. He returned to hosting because he had stopped after a long time. He started the show The Problem with Jon Stewart in 2022.
And
It
it
was canceled
bombed.
after 2 seasons a year later in October of 2023 because Apple executives didn't like how he was covering AI and China. And now he's returning to be a guest host on the Daily Show, which is kind of cool.
A guest host.
Yeah, that's super.
On the
interesting
show that he started.
Had that setback because it looked like that was going to be his new thing, was that Apple show, but then it got canceled because of things he was saying
that's
about China.
truly
about
the case,
AI, and now
bless
as a
him for
result
having
of
the
that,
integrity
it
to
closed
speak up
that
against
door,
China.
and now as a result of that,
China.
he's suddenly coming back to where he started and hosting the Daily Show during an election year, when he potentially has the potential to like influence the discourse surrounding the election and around Biden and Trump and everything else. So it's interesting how that probably something that he really did not experience well during his Saturn return, having those sort of restrictions of what he could say imposed on him, and therefore deciding to leave that, then ending up inadvertently opening up a new door, which could end up putting him in a much more influential place than he would have been otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, cool. All right, well, I think that's all the major celebrity charts that
You know,
we
want to talk about
had.
Pete Davidson?
I mean, if you want to, that is definitely, his love life is definitely one of the most important news events of the last 3 years.
It's not important.
Important?
It's just that that whole time during when he was dating Kim Kardashian, and he was very,
That's
very.
what I don't like about
He
astrology,
became super
right?
popular because everyone's like, why is he getting all the
People
hottest
talking about
girls,
other
you know,
people
all the
that
hottest
they don't know.
celebrities?
Like, I understand that celebrity charts
There's
are
reasons, and
a
then,
good
he-
method
that- just during that, and
to
he went to rehab for a few times during that as well.
figure out transits and how they
so
work
that
just
was
because
just
their life is so
I thought
public.
it was funny to include.
But at the same
It
time,
was super funny.
I don't give a fuck about these people. They don't give a fuck about me.
And it's like, he has a huge Scorpio stellium, so it's squaring all of that, which includes Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, Sun, and Pluto. But yeah, he really was
pissing me off.
during that period in terms of hitting a high point in his career, but also his notoriety, partially the result of all these relationships he was having with all of these famous women, and yeah, that was pretty crazy at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, it was. I just thought it was funny people were referring to him as like, especially men were referring to him as ugly. And,
Oh, it was women
why
too.
is the ugly guy getting, all the girls, and all of them were like, because he's funny and he has like line cook energy.
Whatever
Which
that
now
means.
that the bear is out, you can probably expect that movie.
Yeah, no, that was really impressive. He instilled hope to not like, super attractive looking men everywhere, because he was dating like Ariana Grande, he was dating Kim Kardashian. Wasn't there like one other? There's like one other person he was with at one point as well. It was kind of
Yeah, I can't remember, but yeah.
yeah. Alright, good time. So that's I'm gonna put that as a Saturn return in my book.
Can I do one more real quick? So I just got this one. Bob Odenkirk, he had a second Saturn return. I just wanted to note it because the Better Call Saul has like such a huge fandom, and they did the series finale during the Saturn return. And he also got a Hollywood star, so I felt like that was a really good Saturn return success story.
Yeah, that's a great one. Also because it was such a random
Miss.
thing that happened in terms of how he ended up getting there, because it was just the character he played was originally 10 years ago was just like a side character the way in Breaking Bad, but then the fact that they were able, it was so popular that they were able to spin it off into this whole separate series, which itself became very popular.
How's it feel being a bad boy, Tomizawa? Beating up a
Some
cop?
of that culminated during
Who
this
are you anymore?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just thought that was so cool. Going from Breaking Bad. I don't even know if he was supposed to be on for that long. I think he was supposed to be like a side character. And he was just so great. And yeah, now he's a Hollywood star.
Yeah, for sure. That's a good one. Alright, cool. Well, let's take a little bit of a break. And we'll come back and look at some of your submissions.
Level up. I like it.
まだ
If you
強く
appreciate
な
the
れ
work
る
that we do on this
I'll get to
podcast and you'd like to
level
find a way
99.
to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my
Size
page on
by the end of this.
patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly Auspicious Elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. All right, so we're back from break. Before we move on from the celebrity section, I just wanted to mention a couple of reflections from past ones. It's been interesting after we do these Saturn Return retrospectives, how continuing to see how people's stories play out in retrospect with some of the different celebrities we talked about in different episodes. So one of them that was interesting from the last Saturn Return episode we did in Capricorn was MGK, the rapper, who we talked about at the
MGK,
time.
the
His Saturn
rapper.
Return story was really interesting because he got in like a rap battle with his like idol, with Eminem, who was another famous rapper, and the two of
Rapper.
them released like diss tracks against each other, and it was very divisive. But what's interesting is that after that happened over the past 2 years, he seems to have like made a career switch, and he's sort of not focusing on rap as much, but instead he's focusing on doing this sort of like pop
Bubblegum
punk
pop punk.
sort of thing he's been doing for the past few years, which he's been actually having success at, and maybe has become more successful in that
until
area.
Corey
But
Taylor
it's
came into
interesting
the
because it
picture and
ended up then
completely
being
tarnished
suddenly
that.
turned into it being
Guy needs to know how to shut
almost
his
like
fucking
closing one
mouth.
door in his life and opening another. But it was through this like singular event of like getting into like a battle with his one of his idols. Am I describing that right? Is that like the way?
Honestly, I wouldn't know. I've
Okay.
but I
never
have
personally
heard
been
about
in a
the
rap
rap
battle,
battle. Yeah, I just remember hearing about how he was in a rap battle with Eminem and it didn't go well
Sucks.
for him. Because like, why would you do that? I don't know.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I think the conclusion was that Eminem won, although that MGK had put up the best fight out of anybody that ever attempted to,
Uh,
in the past.
No.
Eminem, so that it was still halfway respectable, but it's interesting
I think
that
they're
to
stretching
whatever
over
extent,
here.
and who knows,
I think they're stretching.
to whatever extent that was.
I
a
think
singular
they're
event
stretching
that
over here.
pushed him to go in a different direction, but it's interesting.
They are
It's an
stretching.
example of sometimes being people going in a different direction after their Saturn return.
かか
Because
っ
of
て
people
き
we
や
see
が
come up in some of these stories we're about to go through. And there was actually another one from the previous Saturn return, which is Ronda Rousey, who we talked about during the Saturn return in Sagittarius, who's a famous MMA fighter, and she was sort of at like the top of that game. And really talked up a lot, but during her Saturn return, she famously lost this major fight against a fighter. And after that, she's made this transition, it seems like, away from MMA fighting and instead focusing on professional wrestling. So it's like another instance where somebody kind of like had one door closed during their Saturn return, but it sent them on a different path and another path that ended up working out for them in some way, or being the path that they were supposed to be on, let's say, in some broader
いらっ
sense.
しゃい。ご要望は？
I'm hoping that's happening for me as well.
Yeah.
Same.
Same.
And then there are some future ones. Actually, let's save these for the end, but I want to make sure that we mention these. So remind me to come back to the future ones, the Saturn and Pisces people. All right, let's talk about some listener submissions. I'm going to zoom through some of these. We have about an hour to do this. So one of the charts that was sent in was by a listener and an artist named Mega McGrath, who has Saturn in the 9th house with the midheaven, the degree of the midheaven, so it's blending 9th and 10th house significations, and Saturn is also ruling the 8th house of debt, other people's money, shared resources, and things like that. And some of the themes for her that came up were a career in art, issues related to debt, and also relocating abroad. So,
これでいい？
okay.
ここをこうして。
here's the
なかなかいい感じ。
I'll read just the summary version because it's very
あとこいつの限界引き出せたみたい。
where she says that I was working in a nightclub, a job I disliked, while trying to pursue a career in art that I had been working on for many years. My habits and finances were out of integrity, and my two identities were at odds with each other. As Saturn ingressed and my Saturn return started, I immediately lost my job as well as all of my art clients overnight. Unable to afford interest payments, I was finally forced to reckon with the amount of debt, 8th house significance, that I had been carrying for years and come clean to my mom. Thankfully, she loaned me the money to pay off my debt under the promise that I create better financial habits. I then had no choice but to rely on my art for income and rebuild from the ground up. In 2021, I met a mentor, 9th house signification, who greatly inspired me and helped me create a clear path
Mentors
forward
being
in my
9th house
career
makes
as
sense.
an
I have my
artist.
south node there.
During
and
those years, I worked very hard. I had a
mentors
lot
were
of
never a thing
success
for me.
and some failures, of course,
Unfortunately.
but my income rose higher than pre-COVID
It would be
levels.
nice if I
By
had
the end of
somebody
my
to
Saturn
help me
return, I
out,
had repaid
but
my
I
loan in full.
don't.
I also took a big step towards my
I do
dreams of
everything by
living
myself,
abroad,
man.
and I got my UK visa. I had to create real structure and integrity in order for the move to happen. I'm proud to say that I live abroad now with a career I've always dreamed of. So this was, I thought, an amazing Saturn return success story, and also just in terms of, from a technical standpoint, how that shows up in her birth chart is just perfect. So, you know, we can see the blending here of the 8th house, which Saturn rules, and some of the issues surrounding money and debt, as well as, you know, loans from other people, and getting one's financial stuff under control. We can see some of the 9th house things, which involve foreign countries, foreign travel, eventually relocation, but also mentorship, or having a teacher who like teaches and guides you is also a very 9th house theme. And then finally, the fact that the degree of the midheaven is there in the 9th whole sign house is an importing major 10th house themes into
But
it.
it turned me around.
Which manifested through her really changing and focusing on this career as an artist and eventually achieving success within the context of that career.
Yeah, there are so many good things and interesting things about this chart and the way it's all working together. I'm looking at too the moon here at 28 Cancer. The part of fortune happens to be there too, but that would have meant that, especially as Saturn crossed back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn, this was also a second house moon transit as well, where it's like a strong moon opposing a strong Saturn. And those financial themes being really carried forward into the overall Saturn return story, which did involve like
I realize
really
you get some of
confronting
that
the
paint on the
debt,
street.
but then like creating a structure to pay all that off and like be able to kind of start fresh after that. I think that's a really interesting combination there.
That's a great point, because that would have been especially the case during the course of 2020 when Saturn first dipped into Aquarius and hit her Saturn, but then retrograded out that summer and went back into Capricorn, where it would have opposed the moon.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm thinking too a little bit about perfection years, which the only way I can do this math is because this person's born the same year as me. But it looks like there would have been, so in 2021, that would have been moving into a 7th house perfection year with Jupiter activated. And then following that in 2022, that would have been the start of the back-to-back Saturn-ruled years. And I think that it's really cool that within those 2 years, with the second of the two being right now, there's this movement from Saturn into Pisces, out of the Saturn return phase, where even more of these long-held goals and dreams are being made manifest career-wise. It's bringing in that whole sign 10th house and continuing those Saturn-ruled midheaven in the 9th themes as well. So that's pretty good too.
That's a super great point. So taking into account what sign or what house Saturn goes into, like right after the Saturn return, as being relevant and being like the first step, you know, in that new cycle of where things head from there.
I think it's really interesting that they lost their job right around the Saturn ingress when Saturn was trying their Mars. Mars at 2 degrees Libra, which rules the 6th house, which is kind of what I would assume that like sort of day job that they had would go in. And I often think about trines as like freeing of the nature of Jupiter, and they have this like lubricant effect. And so it's interesting how Saturn kind of came in with like a denial, but it has this liberating, freeing effect of getting them out of this job that they would probably have not, you know, left otherwise, and kind of had to help. Yeah, didn't have anything else to hold on to. I think that's Malefic Trine can show up in an interesting way.
And also just thinking about what we mentioned earlier, where the first ingress of Saturn also was a first ingress of Mars, and they conjoined at like 0 and 1 degree of Aquarius right on the Saturn, and that was the really hardest event that opened the Saturn return and also the beginning of the pandemic. But then later that year in like December, Jupiter going in there at the same time, and then experiencing an entire year of Jupiter passing through the ninth house with the midheaven at the same time. So there's something about that that's very important in terms of the dynamic about how this set of Saturn returns went for everybody. Obviously that's going to be different for different Saturn returns. How you could sort of predict and set up the beats of like how things are going to go based on those ingresses if you wanted to ahead of time. Yeah, so that is an amazing one. And she's actually a really good artist. Like that was the other thing, is her Instagram account is here. If anyone wants to search for her name.
Sushi Mania is insane, dude.
There's some of her paintings.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah, that's amazing. This is such a good example.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that's what I thought. So that's why I want to start with this one. And thanks to her for sending this into us as a great like Saturn return success story.
It's at Mega McGrath with 2 H's if anyone wants to search.
Yeah, thanks for saying that, mentioning that. Alright, awesome. And I should look at where the transits are now. I'm updating her chart for today, sharing that story. I'm sure, I know everything's in Aquarius right now, so of course that's relevant for everybody.
Lunar return too. Well, probably tomorrow.
Oh yeah, the moon is in Cancer today. So for the record, we started recording this today, Monday, February 19th, 2024. We started now, and we used an election with Cancer rising today. There's the data for people that are curious. All right, let's move on.
It's funny, that chart, I was also born in 91, and there's like 3 girls in my grade who were born 94 that same day. And I think it's just so interesting how, yeah, the same day my friend is a Cancer rising, and just how different things can be, you know. Yeah, it's just always interesting to see like very same but different charts, and how much like a rising sign can change things.
Totally. That's one of the coolest and like funnest parts of this for me sometimes, is seeing both how your friends are going through a similar transit, or sometimes seeing either celebrities or people with different variations of the same chart and how they manifest it in similar but also very different ways. Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the next one. So the next chart is a listener named Morgan, who I told people they could send in a 1-minute video with the write-up, and I was surprised that only like 2 people did. But Morgan was actually one of them. So let me see if I can play that video here within Zoom. Morgan had Saturn in Aquarius in the 8th house in a night chart and also ruling the 7. So that's part of the context for this example, and some of the themes that came up were dealing with death as well as grief and a number of other things. So let me share that.
My Saturn return in the 8th taught me how to integrate and alchemize grief. It started with the publishing of my first book, which is a fictionalized memoir on the loss of my best friend to suicide in 2016. Also during my Saturn return, my grandfather passed away suddenly. I wrote his eulogy, handled his ashes. I got pregnant and then lost a friend of mine in childbirth due to undiagnosed preeclampsia when I was 15 weeks along. And her death helped me advocate for a more positive birth story for myself. I also euthanized a couple of pets and wrote a second book. So Saturn taught me a lot about grief, but also the things that can come of grief and the glimmers sometimes we can find in really dark places.
Alright, so here's the chart with Saturn at 15 degrees of Aquarius. It's retrograde. It's squaring Pluto at 20 degrees of Scorpio. So this is one of the first examples where I noticed that thing I was talking about earlier of just when there's a very close connection between those two planets, sometimes the topics of that house really are coming into play. And we saw the 5th house coming into play. So there was a bigger part to that. So let me actually read. Okay. She says, my first novel, Altogether, was published in 2021 when Saturn was at 12 Aquarius. It's based on my personal experience with the loss of my best friend to suicide in 2016, and much of its content was inspired by journals I filled up in a Greek writing group. This particular friend, his name was Steven, was a previous co-worker of mine. I worked for his family's salon from April 2023. It's interesting because that's also side note. In January 2021, when Saturn first entered Aquarius, I went back to work for them a second time as a front desk coordinator. So I was immersed in the past, our old stomping grounds, when my book was actually published. Not to mention, I totally based the characters on his whole family. They read it first. Stephen's death hurt me tremendously, and I spent a lot of my 20s pretty scarred by it. But the combination of the book being published and my return to the salon helped me to face my grief in a way that I could finally integrate it. I was also able to immortalize him in a way because he was the writer himself and always wanted to write a novel. So for what it's worth, just to add, the first time I went to work for his family was October of 2011, and the nodes were in Gemini Sagittarius both times I worked there. Okay, she says, on May 29th, 2021, about a month after the book was published, my grandfather died suddenly. I ended up writing and reading the eulogy and handled the character's actions. It was my grandma, so I saw it as an opportunity to channel my 8th house Saturn and what he had taught me of grief so far. So that's pretty amazing. Then she says, in March of 2022, I got pregnant. I had been married for 10 years, and we'd agreed on no children, mostly because of my intense fear of childbirth. So this was a last-minute change due to a series of dreams I had about having a son. My husband had a low sperm count, so we were told before we attempted we would likely need fertilization to accomplish a pregnancy. So with that in mind, I figured it couldn't hurt to start trying early. I got pregnant on the first cycle. It was a boy. When I was 15 weeks along, a close friend of ours died in childbirth from undiagnosed preeclampsia. She died on June 25th, 2022. As horrific as her death was, it was an interesting manifestation of my 8th house Saturn return, my natal Saturn-Pluto square in the 5th, and the nodes being at the time. Oh yeah, I forgot about that. That's really important. it seems that the astrology was just too literal. Her death helped me advocate for an electional C-section and tubal litigation. My doctor told me I was the only patient who would write a paper on why I should be allowed to have one. My son was born in a spectacularly positive birth on December 7th, 2022, when Saturn was at 20 Aquarius. He was also born during my Mars return in the 12th. These were my main points of my Saturn return. Smaller things, organizing a few pets, writing my second book, and diving more into esotericism. My Saturn return taught me a lot about resilience, cycles of life and death, and what human combined in between. Yeah, so I thought that was pretty amazing one for a Saturn return. Having that square with Pluto in the 5th house of children, and many of these themes, becoming very, very relevant. She also has Mercury retrograde at 7 Leo, opposite Saturn, and square Pluto, and the Sun, Chiron at 16 and 13. So tying some other themes.
Yeah, baby.
And that 12th house Mars trine Saturn as well. I think it was really interesting that like the 5th house and there being a lot of fears, and she ended up having the 11th C-section. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot there, but 2022. Yeah, I feel like wasn't that the Mars retrograde in Gemini? Yeah, because I had like 3 friends give birth December of 2022 with that Mars retrograde, and yeah, I don't know, that's interesting. Yeah, it's stationed on her natal Mars. Bring it on. But it's the trines to the Saturn and how that played in with the pregnancy is really interesting.
Yeah, and then Mars is the 5th house of children. Part, and it was interesting to see eclipses, which I forgot. For a good chunk of Saturn and Aquarius, we were eclipses back and forth between Scorpio and Forest, square natal Saturn placement Saturn. So that's for sure for some people drawing in
Definitely helps
that
with the
other
job
axis
experience
at the same time for her, both children as well as friends, and the tragic loss of her friend.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, Mercury ruling the 3rd too. I can't even think of if we're thinking of the 3rd as friends as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I am just now thinking about too, is the nodes moving through Taurus and Scorpio during Saturn and Aquarius would have also it would have put Saturn in this position of being at the bends of the nodes, which is often this like really kind of like wobbly feeling where it's like kind of caught between two things, or you find yourself like very much reconsidering a sort of axis in the chart. And I think it's so interesting that the real crux of that was Saturn in the 8th. It's bringing in the 5th house, and Kira, I love what you said about pulling in Mars in the 12th, ruler of the 5th. Like, it's so clear to see how these themes, like, we're going kind of farther away from that initial Saturn placement and the houses it rules, but like it's so clear how these different themes tie in and come to the foreground so clearly. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a good reminder that what they say in one transit, or we're trying to with like the Saturn return. Obviously, there's other transits happening in the chart at the same time. There's usually a lot of other stuff going on that has to be taken into account as well at the same time. But it's interesting how much you can see just from that one transit of Saturn, Saturn return,
Yeah, very much so.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to another example. This is the chart of a listener named Zlatina, who has a 5th house Saturn in Aquarius, and some of the themes that she wrote in about were a casual relationship that got serious, financial issues, attitudes towards motherhood, and conception issues, or issues with conceiving. So the concise description she wrote was, my Saturn return in the 5th house was mostly about a relationship going from very casual to very serious and life-changing over the course of the transit. I had some financial issues that coincided with the Saturn-Uranus squares between my 5th and 8th house, as well as career changes and realizations. My maternal grandmother died, and the way I relate to my mother and motherhood in general has changed. In that regard, I also experienced some health issues which threatened my ability to conceive. I got a master's degree in business psychology. I started taking astrology very seriously and reading about it a lot, and which transformed the way I see myself and the people around me. So, yeah, I thought that was pretty good, especially for one of the themes is of the 5th house can be relationships, especially like casual relationships, like whatever it is prior to like getting married or like having a serious long-term partnership usually goes in like the 5th house. So interesting in this instance, having Saturn there and having like a casual short-term relationship that won't turn into anything, suddenly turning into a long-term relationship is a really interesting manifestation of Saturn in the 5th house.
Yeah. Did they say that they changed careers as well? Did they say that was related to the relationship?
No, I don't think so.
But okay, and then their grandmother died as well.
Right. I mean, I did a summary of it, but it's not. I don't think the career stuff was related to that. I mean, the summary was like dissatisfaction with their job combined with inflation pressures despite a promotion and a raise linked to Saturn transits, she realized her heart wasn't in her chosen career path. Let's go. Which is like a common theme that come up over and over again, of just like realizing your heart really isn't there, and like why should you go?
Yeah, this one has a really tight Saturn-Pluto square. And the I just finished the fertility course and with Nicola also. And like, I want to dissect her chart now and ask him about it. But did she say did she end up conceiving and having a kid or no?
Let me see. For some reason I thought I did, but I didn't put the full write-up here in my notes. So let me find it really quickly.
Just curious, 'cause yeah, I mean, looking at that chart, put money on Saturn being the Almutin of pregnancy and being really, you know, the planet responsible for pregnancy, and with that square to Pluto being activated. Yeah.
I'll bury you.
Yeah.
What ended up being the issue? Yeah.
When I was trying to go through, I was having a hard time summarizing all of the stories.
There's a lot.
So I'll just share it on the screen. So I just pasted it. It's actually amazing how she talks about the build-up of like a casual relationship, the close friend becoming more serious. Because all of these, that's what I'm doing in any of this entire thing that happened over a 3-year period. The details of it, when you hear somebody explain their Saturn is much deeper and richer in meaning, and how the meaning of the chart comes alive in very subtle but evocative ways. So it's kind of hard to convey all of that. Okay, so here's the fifth house part. I have Saturn in the fifth house, ruling over Capricorn Moon, and to me, having a child was always something to be decided after 30. I was always silently judgmental of people I know having children without having proper job or vocation. That's actually really interesting. So in and of itself, he just has a very serious attitude towards children. Let's get this show on the road. Already with Saturn the fifth, counting on other people to help raise them. And we got an all-access look at our newest collection. Behaviors. This all changed, and a lot of things occurred that contributed. I got an illness that could have threatened my ability to naturally conceive. I also realized my partner would make a wonderful father, and that such an experience would even elevate us and make us better human beings. This is all intertwined with me discovering my mother's real birth time in the wake of my grandmother, her own mother's death. We found out that her rising is 20 Aquarius, as her birth time was actually very well documented. I realized that the...
I'm sorry, I was just gonna say I'm scanning it. Doesn't I'm just looking for like my attitude. That's what I'm curious about. But I mean, yeah. I've seen other Libra rising, fifth house, Saturn return, maybe during this time too, during the Saturn return. So, yeah, I was just curious if that ended up
but at least her attitudes towards children and childbirth changed, as well as starting a major long-term relationship where it sounds like she's ready to do that. So that's a pretty
I feel like a white guy voiced him.
awesome.
Yeah. Alright.
Showtime's over, boys and girls. Say your prayer.
And also, yeah, the fourth house theme seems to be really loud for her too. Just like raising her grandmother, and then also the changing relationship with her parents. That was really loud. Yeah.
Short version tenant writes, I have Saturn at 28 degrees in the second house of my chart. Saturn returning to up all of my resources and finances, and the degree position of Saturn throughout the 3-year period tracks with the level of my bank and savings account balance throughout this time astonishingly accurately. Key moments of my financial journey over the last 3 years have been Saturn ingressed into Aquarius, and when Saturn was within 3 to 4 degrees of exactitude in placement. It was only Saturn returned to 0 degrees of Pisces this year that I noticed this significant pattern as the themes returned into my life after several months of financial ease, the first time since the end of 2020. I've always been someone who had a lot of money in savings since I began working at 17. So I like that. It's good because one of the other things it brings up is that sometimes it's only until like after your Saturn return is over when you can step back from it and view that 3-year period in its totality that you can see what the full purpose of it was and what the main overarching themes were. But sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when you're in the thick of it, you may not be able to see it fully yet until the pieces come together.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, the financial.
Look at all that MP I got back.
Saturn
That's
in
ridiculous.
the night chart, second house, but I think what's also interesting is that tight second house with the sun, which rules the eighth house. It was like, there's just, I don't know, the sun feels so bound to Saturn. It's also there, but yeah, it was like both the second and eighth, like being tied up in that Saturn return, not really getting freedom from it until Saturn left Aquarius. Makes a lot of sense, even though it's at sextile. I kind of look at Saturn, especially in domicile, but maybe just in general, as being really, it cares a lot about timing, and it will slow things down. If it needs to, if it's keeping you in the right timing. And it sounds like there was something there with this person around, like there was just a need to experience that contraction for that period of time.
Yeah, for sure. The full write-up is sort of interesting in terms of the sequence of events and what happened over a 3-year period. Intensification of some of the financial stuff that came and went, and how that ended up playing out in terms of starting different side projects and things like that. But it was interesting also from a technical standpoint, as she mentioned, even realizing suddenly in retrospect that this was a theme was that that things had eased up over the past year since Saturn got to like 7 degrees of Pisces. But then it was when Saturn started retrograding back to 0 degrees of Pisces, and some of the issues started coming up again, that she realized that had been a major part of the theme of her Saturn return. And it's because she has Saturn at 28 degrees of Aquarius. So this winter, when Saturn got back to 0 Pisces, it was reactivating that placement basically. So that creates kind of an exception to my like clean 3-year rule in terms of Saturn returns, starting at the first ingress and ending at the last ingress, because sometimes you get these cases where the Saturn's like very early or very late, and there can be overlap, especially if Saturn gets within, especially like 3 degrees at the beginning or end of the sign. Yeah, great. That's good. I would go into that more, but I want to see if we can get through a few others. Just a sec. I'm just trying to figure out where to go next. What houses have we covered, or what houses have we not covered?
The first house.
First house. Let me check.
He's all alone.
It's anonymous. Ask me not to share the name or the birth date, but it was Saturn in the first house of the Ascendant, and there was some open body stuff. So let me read the summary of that, and everyone can just like imagine the Saturn in the first house. So the summary said, the themes of health and body and parenting and becoming the adult came up for me. I had a miscarriage, tried to have children, started in vitro fertilization, explored my feelings around it, bought a house / our first property, started seeing a therapist, increased my responsibilities at work, created an exercise routine, reflected on my relationship with my mom and how I nurtured, found ways to self-soothe instead of relying on an external parent / other. On the last week and the last Saturday of Saturn being in Aquarius, I was present and next to a close family whose they passed away. Up to this point, I'd never experienced death face to face, never been present for someone dying. They were my last and only member of my family in the UK apart from my partner. It was a very poignant experience, to say the least. Spring of 2023, I started studying to become a counselor. Overall, since Saturn left Aquarius, I feel overall like I've been in more of a dialogue with my body and mental health. I exercise more, I eat healthier, and see a therapist regularly. Which I wanted to add, I think that's coming into play also because the 12th house. So she says, I trust myself more, I feel like I know myself better, and I'm also not afraid to be the adult / authority of my own life. I feel more comfortable standing up for myself, while before I would often put my feelings aside for other people's wants and ideas. I also know my limits, and I listen / value my feelings more. So that one's anonymous, but I thought it was a great one. It just summarizes so much stuff that we were talking about earlier, like in a singular example.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who just Saturn literally just crossed my ascendant about a week ago. It's stationed retrograde last year, so this past year I've been very much in Saturn's first land, and that a lot of what Anonymous said tracks for me, just thinking about the 12th house, first house connection. I honestly feel like, and for all the Aries risings out there, I hope you're okay, but 12th house Saturn return was so much of like the surrendering, falling apart, just kind of being like, yeah, I don't know what's happening, you know. But coming into the first, there's so much
We're
more
gonna call a stream here.
like realization
now.
and just being able
Look at
to actually take Saturn's lessons and
Chapter
use them.
5.
And yeah, I
About
don't
a
know
third
just
done.
what they were saying about how much
Later.
they've been putting